All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you not joining us here on the West Coast. My name is Basil Sadek. I'm the Marketing Associate here at VolunteerMatch, and I want to welcome you to our Nonprofit Insight Series, how nonprofits across the U.S. screen volunteers and how you compare. We've got a great topic and a brilliant speaker today. But before I turn this over to Justin, I did want to go over just a few housekeeping notes. First off, all of you are on an automatic mute this morning, so you don't need to worry about any background noise on your part. Just because we can't hear your voice doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. You should see a GoToWebinar toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Once you open that up, you'll see the word questions with either a plus sign or an arrow sign next to it, and that's your questions tool. Please feel free to type in your questions as we go through today's webinar, and we'll start answering them towards the middle and the end. I'm going to be live tweeting today too, so if you're on Twitter and would like to ask a question there or join in on the conversation, you can do so by using the hashtag VMLearn, like VolunteerMatchLearn. All right, let's get started. For those of you not familiar with our service, VolunteerMatch believes everyone should have the chance to make a difference. As the web's largest volunteer engagement network, serving over 110,000 participating nonprofits and 13 million annual visitors, we offer solutions for individuals, nonprofits, and companies to make our mission a reality. Since our launch in 1998, VolunteerMatch has helped the social sector attract more than $10.4 billion worth of volunteer services. If you're new to the field of volunteer management or you're looking to expand your knowledge, our Learning Center offers over 20 webinar topics focused on the field and serves an audience of over 8,000 attendees each year. All right, without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Justin Oberman. Good morning, Justin.
Good morning, how are you?
I'm doing very well, how are you?
Doing great, very excited to have the chance to present today and hopefully have a good dialogue and get some good questions, when we're done with the slides.
Great. Do you want to start by telling our listeners a bit about yourself, and then you can get us started?
Yes, would love to. So this is Justin Oberman, as Basil said, and I have been at SureID for about 4 months. I have come into a newly created role called Vice President of Identity Strategy, which really is about being an external facing presence for the company and working with key partners like VolunteerMatch. And I have a long background in the credentialing and screening field, which I'll get to in a second, but I also just want to say as a sort of personal point that this is a particularly important partnership for me because public service is near and dear to my family's heart, and in particular, and including the nonprofit sector. My mom just retired after 25 years of running a nonprofit in Chicago, and it's just a big part of our personal ethic of our family. And so to the extent that we can help you carry out your missions more effectively, that's really important to us, and I'm hoping that you'll find the information useful today and that we can have an ongoing dialogue to see how we can be helpful. I think that where the sort of substance of this subject matter sort of intersects is that in the case of the work that I did at TSA and the work that SureID has done over the last 12 or 13 years as the company has grown up, has some key similarities to what we want to try to offer to you, and in turn that you can offer to your volunteer cadre. So this is all about screening individuals so that they can have access where needed, whatever the case may be, and obviously it's somewhat specialized in the VolunteerMatch world, but also giving you confidence that the people that are volunteering and serving your populations are who they say they are, have undergone a background screen that's effective, and gives you confidence that your mission can be carried out. So I want to take you through some of that, and as I said, hopefully get some feedback. I found myself at the Department of Transportation in the summer of 2001, working for a mentor of mine, the secretary at the time, Norm Mineta. And about 7 weeks after I got there, 9/11 happened. And as you might imagine, the whole place was turned upside down. And so we started with 3 people in a conference room. And by the end of 2002, it hired 65,000 people. So we like to call it the world's largest startup. We just never had an IPO or anything, but we built a big organization, and like to think that we had a hand in helping respond to and recover from 9/11, getting people flying again. And I started working from the first day, and later at the Department of Homeland Security took over all of our screening and credentialing programs, again doing background screens on people working for TSA, working in the transportation industry, and then extending to domestic airline passengers. And again, the segue from that to SureID, which does this for vendors and contractors who need access to military bases, and then extends to VolunteerMatch, is that we're trying to help individuals go about their business in a more efficient and effective way so that the organizations they're serving can carry out their missions more effectively. And that is really the common thread that works through all of this. So I want to tell you a little bit more about SureID, just so you can understand the experience base that we're offering up to VolunteerMatch. And then I want to tell you a little bit more about our process. And as I said, hopefully have some time for questions. So I think the concept here is that, when you have a SureID type process in place, you're really able to, again, verify that people are who they say they are and gain a good level of confidence that, people that you would otherwise be worried about or not want in your organizations will in fact be prevented from joining. And so, you'd like to think, running a nonprofit organization, that someone comes in and says they want to volunteer, that they can be trusted. What you're really doing with the SureID process is verifying that in fact they can be trusted, and that the often vulnerable populations that you're serving, can receive the benefits that your organizations provide, and there's no sort of downside risk. And so that's really the overarching theme of what we're here to provide. This is sort of a one-slide overview of who we are. We talk about identity assurance, and the reason we use that term is because this is a comprehensive process. I think that we find, whether it's in the government sector, the commercial sector, and certainly in the nonprofit world, that in general, this mission of making sure people who present a potential risk aren't inside your environment, that's not really your core mission. And in most cases, it's quite far from your core mission. And so we talk about identity assurance because we are providing a comprehensive process that includes all of those components at the bottom of the slide there. And so that's really a key element of our offering, is that it is in fact comprehensive and enables you to really turn this over to a partner and know that you can trust your volunteers and you can focus on your mission. I'm going to take you through these steps in a little bit more detail as we go, but again, it's just important to be focused on a comprehensive offering so that you can offload work. We have found in other cases that people are concerned with this kind of a program, and they end up with 4 or 5 different outside providers, and they spend as much or more time managing those 4 or 5 providers than if they just did it on their own. So we're trying to lower your workload while enhancing your capabilities at the same time. The other thing is that our economic model, which we have in our other parts of our business today, will be the same here, which is to say that the volunteer will pay to undergo this process and receive a SureID so that your organization is not financially impacted. And we just think it's a much better way to go. We also have, of course, discounted our normal price for anybody coming through VolunteerMatch, again, for obvious reasons. But the concept here is that volunteers pay. That means there's no restriction on growth. You won't feel like your budget can't cover more people if the number of volunteers grows. The exact opposite. We just scale by ones and twos or thousands and 2000s. So just to give you a sense of what we do today, so that you, I think, can have some comfort that we really understand the challenges here and have the capabilities to meet them. We have been doing work on military bases, but again, on behalf of vendors and contractors since 2004, and we've run 4 million people through the process, and they have used our credential to access these military bases 380 million times. And I think the easiest way to explain it in this context is that it's like TSA PreCheck, but for getting onto a military base. And what we would be doing with VolunteerMatch organizations is TSA PreCheck for verifying your identity so that you can volunteer. And that means that it's a voluntary program. The user pays a fee, but you get a pretty significant benefit on the back end, which is that you can move much more efficiently through the system. And that is what we've built. Obviously, with this kind of experience base, we understand what the requirements are, and there's no ramp-up time. We hit the ground running when we're supporting you. And what's cool about this is that we're not a military contractor. Our paying customers are not those round seals at the top of this slide. They're all the commercial companies at the bottom of the slide whose employees are accessing these bases. So it's the same thing. We don't get paid by Xerox. Xerox's employees pay to have the credential. Xerox may pay on their behalf, but we have an individual relationship, and it would be the same thing here. We would be partnering with nonprofit organizations. Volunteers would be paid to come through, and it's really the same dynamic. I think a defense contractor trying to change how they do business overnight to serve nonprofits would never work. And so that's why the economic model that we relied on since we started is what we're going to apply here, and we think it's just way more efficient and way more effective. So before we get into some of the details, I think it's important to just review some responses. And some folks on this call may have participated in a survey, but we did a survey with VolunteerMatch to just try to get some perspectives on this issue. I mean, we didn't want to show up with some shiny slide deck and be talking about something that isn't of interest at all. And so we ran through and talked to about 700 organizations, reached out to 700 organizations and more than 2,000 volunteers, and we collected some pretty interesting information. By the way, we can share these slides after the fact, so you don't have to take notes. There isn't a pop quiz or anything, and we don't need to necessarily go through line by line, but I think that what's important on this slide is that more than half the organizations we surveyed have a mission in which they're serving individuals. So people interacting with and serving people, which heightens the sensitivity around making sure that you can be confident in who your volunteers are. And given that so many of these organizations' budgets are small, meaning under $1 million, we have to figure out a way to do this without impacting your budget. And so that was very helpful information to get as we're trying to put together this program. And I think what's interesting about this is you see that if you look on the right side of this slide, more than 40% of the nonprofits we surveyed don't do any kind of screening. And that is, we think a number that's pretty high. We think it's probably too high, particularly when you're talking about something as low cost as this, and the fact that it's turnkey without distracting your mission from your mission or your budget. And I think the other key metric on this slide is in the lower left-hand corner, where you've got, nearly 60% sort of relying on what someone is telling you about themselves. And that gets back to the point we made earlier, where we sort of talk about trust being one thing, verification being another. We can presume that most people coming through, like 99.99%, don't present any risk, but it's much better to be able to verify all that. That kind of assumption, really can be troublesome, and it really only has to happen once for it to be a big problem. So that's, again, a key insight that we got from the survey. I think that there's a lot of key numbers on this slide, so I'll maybe go through a couple of these. I think that one thing that's really important is that we heard that 60% of volunteers are generally serving more than one organization. And one of the key things about the SureID model is that if you go through the process as a volunteer and get a SureID, that will then be valid at any participating organization. So we are not asking people to go through this process more than once, and we're not asking them to pay more than once. But all of a sudden, you're now able to use this wherever you go. And so if you are, in your hometown serving 2 different organizations, you go through the process once. Neither of the 2 organizations pay, as I've said, but we're also not putting that burden twice on the volunteer. I think that's really important. I think what also is important is that you look towards the bottom of the slide, the 85% or more of the organizations we talk to that do background checks do pay for it out of their budget. And again, that's not a great use of funding that you're raising from donors. You should be focused on your core mission. And so, that one really stuck out for us. And of course, not surprisingly, 3/4 said that the background checks they are doing are just taking too long and costing too much. And so just so you understand, what we're talking about takes a couple of days, maybe 10 days at the outside, and it's $19.95 to sign up and $5 a month. So you're talking about an $80 commitment, which just in the grand scheme of things is not that much money. And again, it works in any participating organization. So this is really affordable. It's not like we're showing up and asking for some huge contract to be signed with funds that an organization just doesn't have and can't spend this way. So these results were really helpful to us in terms of validating some of our hypotheses and really wanting us, making us want to come forward with a proposed program here for anybody in the VolunteerMatch world. And I think this slide here just kind of underscores the point I made a minute ago, and that is that it isn't a matter of having 100 people show up to volunteer and finding that 23 of them have some disqualifying information. It's a matter of stopping one here, one there. But what that does, when all 100 of those folks have gone through the process in this example, you've now been able to just lower risk in a very material way across your entire organization. And that is really kind of the main thrust of what we're trying to convey. So here is a little bit of detail. And again, we can share the slides with you afterwards. We can talk about this more in the Q&A. But I think what is really important on this slide are a couple things. One, this is a comprehensive process. And so we're not a background check company. We know that that organizations that are doing this today sort of tend to default and say, yeah, I use the ABC background check company. Of course, that's not enough. And that's because, as you see on this slide, background checks is just the third column from the left on the top row. There's a lot of other components to what we're doing, and I think it's really important to understand what a comprehensive process includes. I think another thing that I would highlight on the second row in the light blue is concept of operations. And what that means is that once someone goes through the process and has their identity verified, they have a SureID, we're going to make this work in whatever way that makes sense for your organization. So you don't have to go spend any money putting up new gates, hiring guards, the kind of thing that you might see in a military base. It's the exact opposite. You can operationalize this any way that you want. So in some cases, it may be a matter of showing an ID before you enter a building, and that's fine. That's where the organization's work is taking place. But in other cases, that picture on the prior slide, those folks were handing out supplies from the back of a truck. You may just say, hey, as you arrive at the parking lot on a Saturday morning to take care of X, Y, and Z, we're going to ask to see your ID. And we also are not going to generally ever recommend that you set this up with big fancy scanners. You can just obviously use the phone to validate that somebody's ID is valid. The way we've set this up, the scanner is the phone. The phone is the scanner. So I think this is really important. A couple other things I'll just highlight here. You know, we need to collect information from people so that we can perform the screening that we do. And that happens in a two-part process. One is web-based pre-enrollment, which means you can do it at your house or at your office, not be rushed, take your time. It's designed to be very easy to go through, no intimidation or anything like that. And then there's an in-person enrollment component, and we'll give you a little bit more detail on this in a minute, but we are building a nationwide network of retail locations where you can get enrolled, and by May, we'll be within a 20-minute drive of 80% of the U.S. population. So it's going to be very easy for people to get enrolled when they want, where they want, no hassle, no waiting in lines, no going to some weird address they've never been before, and it makes it much easier. The other thing is that once the background checks are done, you see in the upper right-hand corner, adjudication. That's really important. We don't, give you a big stack of criminal history records that you're not trained to read and just wish you the best. We do all that work. We have a dedicated team at SureID, about 75 people, and that's what they do. They spend all their time looking at background check results and helping our customers understand who's within the requirements and who's outside the bounds. Very difficult work, but they have been at it now for over a decade. And it's a huge release of workload and stress for you. We can work with you to tailor the standards, but we're now in a position to say, Smith is a green, should get a SureID. Jones, we have to do more information and figure out whether or not he or she should volunteer. Just much, much easier for that to be handled on our side of the fence, as it were, so that, again, you can focus on your core mission. So again, we can talk about this a lot more. There's obviously a lot of detail here. We can share this with you afterwards, but again, the headline is an end-to-end process that you don't have to spend time or money trying to execute. So here's, talking with Basil at the outset of the process and getting ready for today, we wanted to make sure that there was some, lasting value from the presentation itself, regardless of how you might choose to proceed or not proceed. And so we wanted to share with you what we call our self-assessment checklist. And the way we view what's on this slide is that a system that you might put in place so that you can mitigate potential risk in your volunteer core should have these 8 attributes. And it's complicated. I mean, it's a long list. 8's a lot of attributes. But we think it's really important for you to have effective confidence in your volunteer cadre, and again, for you not to be burdened with an operational or financial requirement that is just taking you way away from your mission. And what we find, and again, we find this again, whether we're talking to a government agency, private sector company, or a nonprofit of one stripe or another, very few people can confidently say that their system has these 8 components. And so what we would encourage you to do is to really familiarize yourself with this list, go through it. We are happy to talk to anybody that wants to talk in person or over the phone, whatever the case may be, kind of help you go through this. This is not the kind of thing that takes 6 months, by the way. It takes a couple of hours. It's really quite efficient and helps you sort of cut to the chase. And again, when you can confidently say that you have these 8 components in place, you can also then say, look, we are really doing everything we possibly can to mitigate risk and to reduce the operational and financial burden. And so it's important just to kind of familiarize yourself with this and understand how it might apply in your organization. Let me just take sort of 10 seconds on each, though, just to give you a little bit of color, just because, there's a little bit of jargon in here, and I want to make sure that it's clear. So flexibility means that some organization may set the bar at a foot off the table, and some other organization may say we need to be 18 inches above that line. That's fine. We can tailor and adjust it as it goes. So we want to make sure that if you're dealing, for example, with particularly vulnerable populations, or you're serving kids or something where you have a much greater level of worry than a different kind of organization, we can handle that. Unified credential we talked about. Again, this is the concept of reflecting how the world works in volunteers, which is that more than half the folks are serving more than one organization. Let's make it easy for you, but more importantly, easy for them. And so that's what that's about. Pre-clearance is really important. You know, people, if they want to sort of do some kind of harm, they get very familiar with the process and say, hey, look, I can get inside for a week or two, and then by the time they are on to me, I'll be long gone. We don't have to do it that way anymore. We can clear people ahead of time and make sure that everybody's comfortable before they start working. On the other hand, you have the flip side problem, which is that somebody passes a background check and then something later that's disqualifying shows up in their background. And in some systems, you say, well, we do background checks every 5 years, so we don't really know what's happening after they're cleared, but we assume they're okay. We don't do it that way. Our system does what we call ongoing monitoring. And if something disqualifying shows up, information changes in one way or another, whether that's a month or a year later, we can notify you right away and you can take action. So it's really important concept. I think that is also related to the next one, which it has to do with unbiased vetting. You know, it can be tricky to insource this process because you know, you have human beings looking at information on other human beings, and it's much better for that to happen at arm's length where there's no bias and you just call balls and strikes really clean. When you turn this over to an outside partner, you get that. We think it's really, really critical. And that, of course, leads into the sixth point, which is to have a managed service. Again, taking this comprehensive process and turning it over to somebody else so you can focus on the mission. Scale is really important. You know, we're doing an article with VolunteerMatch in the Philanthropy Journal, and we start the article by talking about the fact that over the last 4 or 5 months, volunteerism is at record levels, which is awesome. It's what we all want to see. And so we don't want to have any cap on growth. We want to be able to handle people as they come through. Given the scale which SureID operates, given the scale of this amazing retail network reaching 80% of the population, we can just scale up. And again, whether it's one new person every hour or 100 new people every minute, when the user pays for him or herself to go through the process, it just scales up. And then finally, collaboration. I think the issue here is that we want to try to demystify this process for you. You're not in the security business, and you shouldn't be in the security business. That's our job. And so we want to make it very easy to work together, take you through the process, help you understand how folks can go through it, starts on the web, and off we go. And so these are the key traits, kind of the 8 pillars, if you will, that we think every process should have. And again, we can help you go through that probably on 1 or 2 calls. It's really quite straightforward to get through. And that now sort of takes us to how do you get started? And it's really pretty easy. If you want to enroll your organization, which you can do at this web address, you know, we will pick up the phone right away and get the process organized so that your volunteers can start to participate, and then their pre-enrollment starts at the other web address, sure.id/VM, and they're off to the races. So it's really largely self-explanatory for the volunteers, which is obviously by design. And I hope, you know, based on what we've talked about today, it seems pretty straightforward for you guys as well. So with that said, let me wrap this up, and I'm happy to take any questions. I would just say one final piece on this last slide. You know, we worked on this tagline of use it, demand it, and what I think is important is that it encompasses both sides of the fence. In other words, the volunteers and the organizations that they're serving. So volunteers can feel comfortable that they've gone through the process. They can use the SureID every time they show up to volunteer, and you as a volunteer organization can say, hey guys, if you want to serve our organization and the people we serve, you know, we're going to demand that you go through the process and see SureID. So we like it because it kind of encompasses both sides of the dynamic and everybody feeling more safe and secure about how they're going to proceed. So with that being said, I would be happy to take any questions or comments. I would prefer no complaints about how the TSA checkpoint works. I left a long time ago. I still get those complaints every day, but let's focus on VolunteerMatch for now.
Great, Justin. Thank you so much for all of that information. We have so many great questions from our listeners, and I just wanted to thank them for truly making this webinar an engaging one. But before we dive into questions, I did just want to say that if you would like a copy of the self-assessment checklist, we went ahead and tweeted that out from the VolunteerMatch handle, so you can download a copy there. And the best way to access that is to just type twitter.com/volunteermatch in your browser's URL input field, and then you can get a copy of that checklist there. All right, so tons of great questions. Let's go ahead and get started. This first question, I might be able to answer a bit myself, and then Justin, I'll give you an opportunity to weigh in too, if there's anything that you'd like to add. So one of our listeners asked, can a volunteer help onboard an organization that does not have a background check program? Long answer short, it's okay if they're trusted. If they volunteered with your organization before and they're a volunteer that you trust and can rely on, go ahead. If they've gone through a security screening process, sort of like the one that Justin was referring to, that's even better. Really, it's critical that they're helpful and that they're not managing the process. Managing the process really comes down to a staff member's role. It's their role to get buy-in and support from leadership, from stakeholders, from constituents. So it is possible as long as they're trusted, but we do not recommend that they manage the process. That really should be reserved for a staff member. Justin, is there anything that you would want to add to that answer?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I guess the only thing I would add is, you know, we're not a big faceless company here. We're happy to kind of talk through those issues. So don't hesitate to reach out. Again, we can jump on the phone or have a meeting and kind of talk you through it. I just would underscore that because we want to, our whole mission here is to demystify the process and make it easily understandable and actionable for you.
That's a great addition. And then for those of you who want Justin's contact information, that will be sent to all attendees approximately 1 hour after this webinar is over. All right, next question. Another one of our listeners asked, what are some of the benefits to a volunteer for getting started with a credential like SureID?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think the real first step is to go to the URL sure.id/VM. I think that as we get going here at the beginning, there really should be some communication with the nonprofit up front. So we would never obviously discourage a volunteer from signing up. We want as many people to sign up as possible. But I think that depending on how a particular organization or group of organizations in the same city or something want to proceed, I think further communication out to volunteers is going to make a lot of sense. I mean, we don't want people to feel like they're adrift in the ocean and, hey, am I supposed to go to some website? Why am I doing that? Do I have some due date? I think we want to communicate clearly, and then as we get traction, it will become more ubiquitous. So we wouldn't want to in any way discourage somebody from going to sign up, but I think we would also want to encourage organizations to communicate directly, and we'll obviously help put that communication together.
Great, thanks, Justin. We just got a really great question in, and I think that you'll be able to answer this one very well. So one of our listeners says that they're considering a process similar to what SureID is offering. However, most of their positions are telecommuting, and they do not have a lot of contact with their volunteer populations. would a service like SureID still be a good fit for them?
Yes, and I think the way I would explain it is when we talk, let me just hop back just so you can see it. When we talk on this slide about the concept of operations, it really is tailored to each organization's mission. I think what, so another way to say that is that the primary benefit of doing this, particularly when you're in a situation where someone is not going to a physical location every day, which is, obviously what's happening with our the contractors going to military bases, they're going to a fixed facility every day. Where you're going to get the most benefit is having people go through the process on the front end and then have the ongoing monitoring on the back end in case disqualifying information shows up. In the example of that question, it's less important that every single Tuesday that person's badge gets read by a mobile phone at the front door of a building. That is not really where a potential risk presents itself. The risk really needs to be mitigated and will be mitigated when someone undergoes the background screen on the front end, and then we do ongoing monitoring on the back end. So absolutely yes, and that has come up in other contexts and an easy one for us to work through.
Fantastic. All right, next question. We're going to keep moving on. So another listener asks, what are some of the problems or gaps inherent in the traditional background check process? Could you address some of those?
Yeah, so I would say three problems. One is that most background check providers do not have a comprehensive process, and that is really, again, what's on this slide. So I think that's really important. Background check companies will do a background check, give you results, and they go on to the next customer. I think the second thing is that you're in a situation where the financial burden is often falling on the organization instead of the individual. And the third piece is lacking this ongoing monitoring component so that someone undergoes a background check and then they're free to navigate for some undetermined amount of time. So those are the kinds of things we do that we think are really critical if this is going to be effective for a nonprofit. It has to have those components.
Great. And then to speak a little bit about your second point, when we surveyed our community of nonprofits, we asked them if they typically pay for background checks or if they have their volunteers pay. And I'm looking through the survey results now, but from what I remember, it was close to 80%, certainly more than 50% of organizations do pay for the background checks themselves. And when it comes to our goals and our mission, sometimes that tends to take sort of a back burner approach to where, we tend to think of security as a secondary when really it's important and essential to the mission. So again, that was a great answer. Moving on to the next question. Does SureID have a Canadian branch as well?
So the short answer is yes, we can operate in Canada. The longer answer is we don't have a Canadian branch per se, but having this work in Canada is doable. I think that there are some things we're going to have to work through on the background check side, just because the way that criminal history information is managed is different. But we're more than happy to have the discussion and figure out how we can do it.
Great. Next question. What risk is there if an organization doesn't use a service like SureID? What could a bad person, per se, do if the responsibilities do not involve direct contact with vulnerable populations or finances where an obvious liability might exist? Could you provide maybe some scenarios on how a virtual volunteer might be able to damage the reputation of a nonprofit?
So in general, I would defer to folks running these organizations because they're going to be much more familiar with their specific environments. That being said, when we start talking about virtual volunteers and people not having direct contact with, recipients of these organizations' work, what generally pops to the top of the list are things related to IT systems and cybersecurity, where you could do a lot of damage if you're able to break into a system. But in general, I think that we are focused on making sure that harm is not done to the folks that are being served by these organizations. But in the other parts of our SureID business, there is a huge focus on preventing people who want to do harm from getting access to, sensitive IT systems and sensitive data. And that is fundamental and part and parcel of what we would be providing here for VolunteerMatch members.
Great, thanks, Justin. Now we've had a few people ask this one, and I'm assuming that you know this question's coming up. But one of our listeners says, assuming we want to move forward with our organization, hopping on board with SureID, what are the costs associated and who pays for them?
Yeah, so the beauty of this system is that the volunteer pays. The nonprofit doesn't pay, and it's $19.95 to sign up and $4.95 a month. So the first year totals $80, and there you have it.
And that is a discount that's exclusive to our partnership, correct?
That's right. Well, we have a couple of other nonprofit partners, but that is a special rate that only nonprofits get.
Great, thanks, Justin. Next question. We're going to keep rolling. I hope you're doing well from your end. How does an organization enroll or get on board with the system? Is it expensive at all for the organization or complicated for them to get started?
I don't think so. I think the biggest thing that we want to handle at the beginning is understanding the nature of the organization and how volunteers, serve the mission. And the second thing is figuring out how to communicate with your volunteers so that they know to go sign up for a SureID. That's really where the effort is expended, and it's actually pretty straightforward.
Great. Next question. Are there any special steps that two or more organizations can take together to benefit jointly from this approach? For example, partnering up with another organization to sort of get started on this new process, to engage their stakeholders, to bounce ideas off one another. If you have any tips on how to sort of address that process, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any particularly brilliant tip other than that we would be delighted to talk to as many organizations at the same time as possible, so everybody's kind of hearing the same information at the same time and being able to share ideas. One of the key benefits of SureID is that the credential, once you get it, works at every participating organization. So inherently, collaboration is built into the system, and to the extent that folks want to collaborate from day one, convening a discussion of multiple organizations at once is, far and away more preferable for us. I mean, you're going to have much more intelligence in the room with multiple parties represented, and it's just a more efficient process.
Great. This next question, feel free to answer if you have the right information. If not, I would encourage the listener to reach out to you directly. But if you're familiar with the verified volunteer product, how does that compare to SureID's credential? And I might be able to answer that a little more as well, but I'll give you an opportunity first, Justin.
Yeah, the truth is, if you want to take it, that would be helpful.
So from what I'm familiar with verified volunteers, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that the costs are sort of delegated more to the nonprofit. Again, I would encourage everyone to just double check. But I do know that one way SureID is different is that the volunteer receives a credential, an ID card that they could use virtually anywhere. Whether it's at, the several nonprofits that they volunteer with each year. When we surveyed volunteers, most of them said that they do volunteer with more than one organization per year. So they could take that ID card and use it over and over wherever they volunteer. I believe SureID, you guys were mentioning that there could be other use cases for an identity card like this in the future. So that it's really sort of an all-in-one approach to screening. The volunteer only has to get screened once, and then shortly after that, they can get started with using their ID card just about anywhere that the card is accepted. And the way that it's accepted is the nonprofit downloads a relevant mobile app on their phone, scans the credential, and that's it. The volunteer is verified. No work needs to be done from the nonprofit side. And the volunteer is sort of responsible for making sure that their credential remains up to date. And I know that that's sort of the main difference between SureID and verified volunteers. It is a more innovative approach, and it does sort of help the volunteer ensure that they only have to do the screening once. Again, in our survey, we asked volunteers about their attitude towards receiving a background check and being screened. And for the most part, they were very open to it. Volunteers understand the security issues and risks that are associated with running a nonprofit, but they're okay in knowing that a credential like this could help the security of that nonprofit's mission, and not just one nonprofit, but all the nonprofits who decide to get started with SureID. I hope that answers your question a little bit to the listener who asked, but if not, I highly recommend you reach out to Justin directly, me or Justin, and either one of us could get that information to you to really help you build that case. Okay, moving on to the next question. Again, I did say we have tons of great questions, and a huge thank you to our listeners for really making this an engaging two-way webinar. We really appreciate it. All right, next question. If the organization wants to pay, let me restart that. Another one of our listeners says that they are in New York, but would like to volunteer for an organization that's in Spain. Would an ID card currently help them secure their identity overseas, or is that something else that they should consider?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's not part of a ongoing screening program overseas, it probably won't be that meaningful. To the extent that, you want to present something overseas and ask SureID to describe the process that you went through to get it, that might be helpful. But this is really designed for people that are participating in the network, which is quite far-flung, but doesn't necessarily apply to one particular organization or location overseas.
Great. And we did have another listener weigh in on the verified volunteers comparison question. And she said that if the organization wants to pay for the volunteers' background check, it does come out to be $80 per volunteer. So that is a pretty hefty price. And again, I do encourage you guys to do the research yourselves, or reach out to Justin and I, and we can help provide some additional information for you. Moving on to the next question. One of our listeners says that he works for a small nonprofit that already have some difficulty recruiting volunteers. And it seems like asking volunteers to pay for the background checks would discourage many of them from joining us. Is it possible for the organization to pay for at least some of the SureID membership costs?
Yes, it is. It's that simple. We can easily arrange for that.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, let's move on and take one more question. And this next question comes from a listener who's asking, are there any special, oh, we've already answered that. All right, here's another question. Could you give us an example of the types of records or sources of records used to verify and screen individuals with your product?
Yeah, so generally speaking, we're looking at identity documents like driver's licenses and comparing that to information, that the DMV has when you receive a driver's license. And then most of the other information is based on criminal records, which are coming generally from the county, state, or federal level. So it's pretty straightforward. We're pretty transparent about that. And it's pegged usually to where you live, your address history over a certain period of time. But it's pretty straight, criminal history information based on court records and that kind of thing.
Thanks, Justin. And then a few slides ago, we referenced a self-assessment checklist. So this next question is specific to that. Can you provide additional detail on how organizations should undertake this suggested self-assessment? What are the next steps that typically follow an exercise such as that?
Yeah, I think that getting through this is probably accomplished in 1 or 2 maximum phone calls. We can help you. We would want to understand your process today, go through the steps on the checklist in a little bit more detail. Might require a second call if there's further information that somebody needs to go track down about how internal processes work. And that's it. So it's pretty straightforward. The power of it is in the content. The process itself is not very cumbersome or difficult.
Thank you, Justin. I think we have some time for maybe one more question, and then we can start closing out. And I promise this time this is the last question. So how do you envision that organizations will verify an individual once they've been approved every time that individual arrives at a location to volunteer?
Yeah, so as we alluded to before, that's really quite case specific based on the nature of what someone's doing, when they're volunteering, where they're showing up, and that kind of thing. And, we will work that out with you depending on the needs of your organization. But the beauty of what we've built is that to the extent we want to scan an ID and verify that it's still valid, your phone becomes the scanner. So there's no new infrastructure required. It's very very seamless and easy to do.
All right. So I know I said earlier that we will take one last question, and I lied. We have one more question that just came in. That's super relevant to today's topic. So we will just address this one last question, and then you guys are free to go. All right, this listener asks, would it be possible to have the volunteer pay for the background check up front after a certain period of time? So not immediately, to ensure retention of the volunteer. For example, she was thinking that the organization could possibly reimburse the volunteer after a year of service and reimburse them up to a certain dollar amount, like $50. Do you think that's a good idea? What are your thoughts around that?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I'd probably want to understand the dynamics a little bit better, but there's a lot of flexibility built into our approach. And so I think there's probably few things that we would think are not a good idea, because the mission here is to make people feel more comfortable about, you know, their volunteer cadre and their ability to serve their population. So we can certainly get into those details, but I can't think of a reason why that wouldn't work.
Great. And Justin, just to confirm, your email is justin@sureid.com, correct?
It's joberman@sureid.com.
Okay, fantastic. So if our listeners do have any follow-up questions that they want to ask, or if they just want to talk about the process a little more and how to get started, please feel free to reach out to Justin directly at joberman@sureid.com. We are approaching the top of the hour, so if you do have a question that didn't get answered, you could email Justin directly. His contact information will also be provided in the follow-up email that you'll receive approximately 1 hour from now. This webinar is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel later today. So if you would like to revisit parts of this webinar, you may do so there. The best URL to get to our YouTube channel is just youtube.com/volunteermatch. Again, in about an hour, you'll receive some more follow-up information in addition to information on how to get started. I did just want to thank you again, Justin, for providing this great webinar and great topics today. And thank you to all our listeners for attending. We hope to see you all on a future Volunteer Match webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.